Hi everyone, this is my paper on prison breaks in late medieval France. During the first public examination of Joan of Arc in her 1431 trial, Joan complained to Bishop Pierre Cauchon about being held in chains. When her jailers said that the chains were necessary because she had tried to escape from other prisons on many occasions, Joan replied, "It is true that elsewhere I wished to escape, and would still do so, as is lawful for all people who are incarcerated or imprisoned." This raises some very interesting questions about medieval attitudes towards imprisonment. Was Joan of Arc reflecting larger cultural attitudes? Would her contemporaries agree that it was lawful for all people to escape from prison? Now, clearly, Joan of Arc is an unusual case. From her own perspective, she was a divinely inspired prisoner of war, but from the perspective of her captors, she was a suspected heretic. As Françoise Michaud-Fréaville has suggested, Joan was very much influenced by medieval miracle stories in which saints, particularly Saint Catherine, one of the saints she saw regularly in her visions, aided the imprisoned in their escape attempts. However, later in her trial, when asked yet again whether she wanted to escape from prison, Joan explained that if she saw the door open and that her guards and the other Englishmen did not make any resistance, she would take this as her permission and believe that God was helping her. But she would not go without permission unless she herself attempted to leave by force, to see whether God approved, and she cited the widely used proverb in French, "God helps those who help themselves." So Joan envisioned the possibility of a miraculous escape, but also considered ways that she might help herself. In this paper, I want to consider those who, unlike Joan, did not have confidence that God would create an opportunity for them to escape, but who had to help themselves. But would Joan's contemporaries agree with her assertion that it was lawful for prisoners to help themselves escape? The first place we might look for an answer would be French customary law. These laws were by definition not codified and therefore not written down, but starting in the 13th century, in reaction to a larger move towards valuing written records, compilations of these traditional laws began to be made. The Coutumes of Touraine and Anjou, compiled in 1246, are very explicit about the illegality of prison breaks. They note that if someone were in prison on suspicion of murder or larceny or some other serious crime for which it was in doubt whether he would be put to death, and he left the prison, he would be as guilty as if he had perpetrated the crime, and if he had admitted it, and he would be hanged even if he had not committed the crime. In this sense, then, escaping from prison was equivalent to admitting guilt, much like choosing to go into voluntary exile while under suspicion of having committed a crime. Philippe de Beaumanoir's 1283 Coutume de Beauvaisis agrees, saying, "When someone is arrested and put in prison on suspicion of some crime, and he escapes from prison and is recaptured, he is considered guilty of the thing he is being held for, and must be punished for it." However, it is significant that the customs of Touraine and Anjou refers to those imprisoned on suspicion of a serious crime, and Philippe de Beaumanoir here does not require capital punishment for someone who escapes, just the punishment that fits the crime the prisoner was suspected of committing. Indeed, elsewhere in the text, Philippe de Beaumanoir considers the appropriate punishment for an escapee who was imprisoned for less serious crimes, arguing, "When someone is kept in prison for offensive language, or because he will not answer in court, or for debt, or for any case which is not a capital crime, if he escapes from the prison, the penalty is at the Lord's discretion, for a man escaping from prison shows great contempt for his lord. But I never saw more than 60 sous set as a penalty." Although the escape is perceived as an insult, Philippe de Beaumanoir suggests that the penalty ought to be a fine, and sets a maximum limit. In this case, though escaping from prison is clearly illegal, it is not automatically considered an offense punishable by death. Philippe de Beaumanoir's lists of reasons why someone might be in prison raises another question about how prisons were being used in late medieval France. In fact, there were a number of different uses for prison. Perhaps the most common use was to hold people who were awaiting trial. The legal system did not move swiftly, and there was generally a delay between apprehending the accused criminal and bringing their case to trial. Of course, not everyone who was awaiting trial had to be kept in prison. Many were released on their oath to return for trial, or were allowed to go home, relying on the oaths of guarantors who agreed to take on the responsibility for bringing the accused back to stand trial. It was generally only those whose oath could not be trusted, who could not find others to stand with them, or who were accused of particularly serious crimes, who actually had to remain in prison for an extended period to await trial. Another category of people who were in prison was those being punished for crimes. Despite Michel Foucault's insistence that the prison was not yet born in the Middle Ages, in fact, prison sentences were often used as a punishment for crime. Our friend Philippe de Beaumanoir recommends prison sentences as punishment for certain crimes such as insulting someone of higher status. Some pardons granted by the French king were contingent on a certain period in prison on bread and water. It is important to note that these prison sentences were usually quite brief, often as little as a few weeks or a month. Prison was also used in this period to hold people who had defaulted on their debts. They would be kept in prison, often allowed to go out into the public spaces of the city to beg or to try to persuade their friends to aid them until they were able to repay their debts. All three of these groups were kept in the same spaces, in similar conditions, rather than being kept separately according to the purpose of their incarceration, as we do today with jails for those awaiting trial and prisons for those being punished. Instead of separating people based on the purpose of their imprisonment, medieval prisons separated people on the basis of their social status. The wealthy could pay for better prison conditions. There are two other categories of prisoners that are worth considering. While some of them might have been kept in the same places as the prisoners I have just described, they were often kept in different, more ad hoc prisons. The first of these is prisoners of war. The period that I am focusing on today was the height of the 100 Years' War in France, and there were many soldiers being kept incarcerated, either awaiting ransom or accused by those who had apprehended them of fighting on behalf of the enemy. As you might imagine, the constantly shifting boundaries of English-occupied France created particularly complicated cases of split loyalties. In a similar vein, some prisoners were prisoners for coercion. Now, what does that mean? Fortunately, Philippe de Beaumanoir provides us with a definition of the term. He explains, coercion is if I keep someone in my prison, locked up or in irons until he has given or sold something to me, or made some agreement to do so. And if he does so and gives me sureties or security, he has a cause of action against me where he can say that I used coercion. Thus, clearly for Philippe de Beaumanoir, using prison for the purpose of coercion is illegal. Yet interestingly, he explains that legitimate imprisonment could also provide the circumstances for coercion, noting, someone may happen to be arrested on suspicion of a crime, and because of his fear of a long stay in prison or of being punished for the act he is accused of, even though he has no guilt, he gives something to be released from prison. We say he can ask for it back and cancel the agreement, provided that he submits to a trial on the case for which he was held. For Philippe de Beaumanoir, then, the line between illegitimate, coercive imprisonment and legitimate imprisonment as part of the legal system is not as clear as we might expect. Although it is just as illegal for the official representatives of justice to accept payment for releasing someone from prison, he does not refer to any kind of punishment for those who accept the bribe. He simply notes that the contract is invalid. So, after looking at French customary law, we find that the situation is a lot more complicated than Joan of Arc's statement that it is lawful for all those who are imprisoned to escape. All of the examples reveal that incarceration was not a simple and straightforward thing according to 13th century customary law. While there was certainly an understanding that escaping from official imprisonment was illegal, it seems that the legitimacy of incarceration may be all in the eye of the beholder. Philippe de Beaumanoir's expectation that imprisonment, even by official representatives of justice, might constitute coercion blurs the line between governmental officer and brigand. If this was true in the 13th century, when these customs were recorded, how much more might these lines be blurred during the 100 Years' War? As loyalties and boundaries were in a constant state of flux, how people understood their own identity as prisoners might differ radically from how their jailer perceived them. In order to examine this complexity in practice, we'll turn now from normative law codes to some letters of remission composed on behalf of people who orchestrated or assisted in a prison break in 14th and 15th century France. Remission letters, written to the French king to request a pardon for having committed a crime, are couched in the language of mercy. And through the Speech Act encoded in these letters, the king exercised his power over the lives of his erring subjects, allowing them to escape the death penalty despite their admission of guilt. The first letters of remission appeared in the records of the French king's chancery at the beginning of the 14th century. The earliest of these letters were mostly granted to people who claimed to have been falsely accused, or to forgive members of the nobility who had been engaged in warfare that was not sanctioned by the king. Over time, letters were also granted to non-nobles as a pardon for crimes that they had committed, though remission was only available for capital crimes, those punishable by death. Through this development, the French king made a number of interrelated claims about his power and authority. By choosing to grant life instead of death to his erring subjects, the king was exercising his powers of grace and mercy. His mercy did not reflect justice, but, like God's mercy established in the promise of the New Testament, it acted above human perceptions of punishment as a direct correlation to crime. On a lower plane, remission letters enacted the king's power to override the execution of justice in his realm, thus making him the equal of the emperor. As these related concepts of mercy and authority demonstrate, remission was not about justice, but about power. The king could and did act above the law in granting pardons, and there was no need for petitioners to establish their innocence. Indeed, most of the petitioners admitted their guilt, much as they might in a confession to a man of God. However, they were careful to establish that the crime was unusual and not part of a criminal lifestyle. The king was gracious in his mercy, granting remission even for the crime of treason, and even in some cases pardoning an individual for a crime for which his or her partner had already been executed. In most cases, remission was sought by individuals who had already come to the attention of the local officers of justice. Generally, they had either fled the region after committing the crime, or were being held in prison awaiting trial. Remission letters for those incarcerated reveal a strong fear of prisons and a recognition of time spent in prison as punishing, even if it was not officially being used for that purpose. Trials could be lengthy, and only the noble or wealthy could buy special treatment in prisons, so some remission letters, highlighting the unpleasant conditions there, implied that sufficient punishment had already been meted out through a particularly long imprisonment. Many letters indicated further that the individual was likely to die before the completion of the trial, suggesting that prison could become a de facto capital punishment. Despite the fact that the crimes for which these individuals were on trial were punishable by death, the letters suggest that an unintentional, private, and therefore meaningless death in prison would violate the purpose of punishment. These narratives about the risk of death suggest that prisons were deeply unpleasant and rigorously guarded places where the imprisoned were cut off from all social and family ties. However, stories about prison breaks reveal a very different kind of space, one with far more porous boundaries, and prison guards who might be complicit, or at least complacent, in the event of an escape. These narratives of prison escapes can be divided into 4 broad categories. Several stories highlight the inattention, whether long-term or momentary, of the jailers, and indeed several of these remission letters were written on behalf of the jailers themselves, who had to explain how someone had managed to escape from their charge. In a related vein, some narratives describe a perfect moment of opportunity, much like the open door of Joan of Arc's imagination. However, some letters involve a more concerted effort on the part of the escapee, either helping themselves or with assistance, either from other prisoners or from family or friends outside the walls. Cases about the negligence of jailers suggest that some prisons were less like an impenetrable fortress than others. They reveal some of the close interactions between guards and their prisoners. As Patricia Turning has argued, by their very nature of their office, wardens, jailers, and guards were placed in a fairly multifaceted role. They were the points of contact between the administrators and the inmate, so they had to make sure they complied with the official stipulations and regulations, while also protecting themselves in their daily interactions with the prison population. They stood between the public and those incarcerated, and had to present themselves as both disciplinarian and humanitarian. Because medieval religious teachings recommended visiting the imprisoned, and prisons were generally located centrally in medieval towns, the general public could and did observe the actions of the wardens. Walking the line between disciplinarian and humanitarian could be difficult for the guards, and sometimes the wardens' efforts to negotiate those potentially incompatible roles created opportunities for prisoners to escape. There are several letters composed on behalf of jailers whose prisoners had escaped. Pierre de Moustier explained in a letter from 1425 that he was not physically present when the prisoner in his charge escaped, but he was nevertheless responsible for the man. As lieutenant of the captain of the castle of Gassé, Pierre had charge of Jehan de Launois, who was imprisoned at the fortress. Since Gassé did not have a court that could prosecute him, Launois needed to be taken to the bailiff of Rouen, who was in Bernay at the time, about 41 kilometers away. However, the captain of the castle was absent, leaving Pierre in charge, and Pierre was concerned about the dangers of the roads between Gassé and Bernay due to the brigands and soldiers in the region. Launois was being held by Henry Churstel, an Englishman living in Gassé, and after agreeing to bring Launois to Bernay and taking charge of him, Pierre chose to leave him with Henry, requesting that he be kept in a secure prison until Pierre could gather enough men to go with him to Bernay. Launois remained in prison until midnight that night, when he broke his shackles and escaped through the moat, disappearing completely. Pierre explained that it was clearly not his fault, but he was technically responsible for the prisoner at the time and feared that the king's bailiff would pursue him for the escape. Pierre's letter also reveals some of the complexity of living in occupied France. The 1425 case of Estienne Wingham, an English-born jailer in Alençon, goes even further in describing these divisions of loyalty. Whereas Pierre was not really at fault for the escape of Launois, Estienne collaborated in removing 2 Armagnac captives from the custody of a townsman named Robin Wardel into a barn, where he kept them hidden for over 2 months. Although the captives were no longer kept in chains, they were not able to find a way to leave the town, partly because Estienne was waiting for them to pay him for his efforts in helping them escape. They tried to persuade Estienne to allow at least one of them to go out under the walls and find the money to pay him, but he was reluctant to do so. In the meantime, the two prisoners were sought through the town by the sound of the trumpet, and Estienne panicked. He confessed to a priest that he had taken the prisoners from Robin Wardell, and shortly thereafter they were recaptured and imprisoned alongside Estienne himself. In some ways, this story echoes Philippe de Beaumanoir's concerns about the ways that official prison could be similar to coercive prison. While Estienne was not keeping the two Armagnacs in prison conditions per se, he did control their movement from the barn where they were held until they could pay him for their escape. Launois seems to have acted opportunistically, taking advantage of a moment of laxity when those who were really in charge were absent. The two unnamed Armagnacs, on the other hand, were able to capitalize on the corrupt guard Estienne Wingham. In both cases, the escapes were facilitated by the upheaval of the war. Launois was able to get away because Pierre was concerned about the dangers of the road, and the Armagnacs were taken from the custody of a Frenchman with the aid of an English jailer. Not everyone who was fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of the inattention of their captors was involved directly in the war. Others were also able to find or create an opportunity for escape, often by exploiting the inherent contradictions in the role of the jailer. In 1424, Simon de la Porte and his wife Jehanne were imprisoned in Cherbourg for having fraudulently sold things that did not belong to them. The couple, who are described in the letter written on their behalf as ancient and feeble people of around 70 years of age, were being held in the royal prisons of Cherbourg when Jehanne escaped from the said prisons and went to her hostel 5 or 6 leagues away to seek her properties, and the next day she came back to take up her imprisonment of her own volition, without constraint, and both of them are still in prison. The letter does not clarify whether Jehanne's age and gender allowed her the freedom to leave the prison long enough to visit her home, though we could certainly speculate on that. Keeping a 70-year-old woman in irons might not have been perceived as humanitarian behavior on the part of her warden. Certainly there is no suggestion that Jehanne had to work very hard to get away. The language of the letter implies that she simply walked away one day and came back the next. Nevertheless, the use of the word échapper does indicate that she was not allowed to leave, which may have been a retrospective effort to deny the responsibility of her jailers. The story of Jehanne Pestivien, Sergeant à Verge for the Paris Châtelet, at first seems to be a narrative about an insider, known by his jailers as a co-worker. However, he was imprisoned not in the Châtelet, but in the conciergerie of the Palais de Paris, and according to the letter composed on his behalf, his escape was, like Jehanne de la Porte's, taking advantage of a moment of laxity on the part of his guards. However, unlike Jehanne, it took time and effort for Pestivien to come by such a moment. The story of how Jehanne Pestivien, whose job was to make arrests on behalf of the Paris Châtelet, came to be in prison at the conciergerie, is well worth exploring. In 1422, Jehanne Pestivien became overly friendly with Jehannette, wife of Pierre de Sergy, who was a prosecutor in Parlement. Though the letter written for Pestivien insists that the rumors were false, Pierre de Sergy believed that the two were having an affair. Pierre used his legal connections, having the bailiff of Parlement warn Pestivien to stay away from Pierre's house, even in performing his duties. This was not enough for Pierre, who then insisted that they each swear assurances to each other in front of the court of the Parlement. Their state of peace lasted for 2 months, until Pestivien had to pass by Pierre's house with an axe that he carried in pursuit of his duties. Seeing that the door of the house was open, Pestivien decided to try to get back the money that he had lent to Pierre's wife when they were still friendly. Unsurprisingly, Pierre returned home to discover Pestivien's axe of office, which he had left in a chest while speaking to Pierre's wife. Pierre said, "This is the axe of a ribaud," and refused to give it back to Pestivien, who asked nicely for it. Finally, Pestivien grabbed the axe and wrested it from Pierre's hands, in the course of which the axe tore Pierre's robe near his chest. Although Pestivien claimed that he had no desire to injure Pierre, he nevertheless had clearly violated their agreement by visiting Pierre's house, even though he had been there in the course of his duties. Pestivien was arrested and put in the pit of the great tower of the Conciergerie of the Palais, where he remained for 11 days and became seriously ill. Due to his illness, Pestivien was taken to a small garden, where he was visited by Jehan de Lespine, royal notary and clerk of the criminal court, who determined that his limbs should be examined by a barber. While they sent for the barber, Pestivien was left alone in the garden, where, fearing that he would die in prison, he noticed a small shed with a slate roof near the tower. With the aid of a trestle, he climbed onto the shed and went through a window into a house in front of the Sainte-Chapelle, then managed to find the door under the treasury through which he left the grounds of the Palais, and finally fled from Paris. In the letter composed on his behalf, Pestivien represents his escape as entirely opportunistic, but it is interesting to note that his complaints about his severe illness created the circumstances in which he was left alone in a less secure location than the tower he was usually in. Interestingly, Jehan Pestivien's illness, like Jehan de la Porte's age, facilitated his escape. In both cases, the jailers seem to have erred on the side of kindness in their treatment of their prisoner, and that kindness allowed them to get away. It was not always the negligence of the jailers that allowed a prisoner to escape, however. Sometimes prisoners banded together in order to elude their captors. This was particularly true of the brigands who took advantage of the instability of the 100 Years' War. When multiple members of the group were imprisoned, they could work together to escape. According to a letter composed on his behalf in 1423, Henri du Sauchet was asked by a few other men, including Joan Lebas, to join with them to beat up Colin Martin in order to extort money from him. The letter represents Henri as an unwilling participant in the brigandage of his companions. At first, Henri refused to join them, but they finally persuaded him to hold on to one of their horses while they attacked Martin. When they took Martin from his home, Henri explained, he followed behind them with the horse, fearing that they would kill him. Although, according to the letter composed on his behalf, Henri stayed out of the fray and told his companions several times that they really shouldn't be doing this, he did stay with them the whole time and accepted a share of the money when they pressed it on him. 8 days later, the crime came to the attention of the Vicomte of Cherbourg, who imprisoned Henri alongside Joan Lebas, who had been accused of treason. That very night, Henri and Bas used a rope from a well to descend into the moat of the castle, from which they went straight to the church to claim sanctuary. Henri had no opportunity to plan his escape, but rather was able to take advantage of a prison break in progress, and the narrative in general suggests that he was more of a hapless bystander caught up in events beyond his control. Indeed, Henri was still in the church when he sought pardon, since he did not want to abjure the realm and leave behind his wife and 3 children. Henri was able to join up with a fellow prisoner in order to escape, but the story of Jehanot Dugne, a 27-year-old laborer living in Ouchy-la-Ville, demonstrates that help could also be available from outside. Jehanot had married Isabelle around Pentecost of 1399, which would have been in mid-May. She was arrested 6 months later, on November 16th, 1399, on suspicion of having drowned her infant at night without having baptized it. The letter, interestingly, leaves all the speculative math up to the reader. I had to do the calculations myself to realize that the child might not have been Jehanot's, or at least certainly was not conceived within the marriage. Isabelle was then kept in prison for another 6 months, from November until May 15th, 1400, which would have been a year after their marriage, when Jehanneau, for the compassion, affection, and love that he had for his said wife, brought a long ladder to the prisons and broke her out. He took her to the church, from which she fled the region. Unfortunately, Jehanneau was not as savvy as his wife, and was himself arrested and put in prison, where he languished for what he describes in the letter as a long time, and he is still there in very great poverty and misery, likely to miserably finish his days there. It is worth pointing out, however, that poor Jehanneau received his letter of remission from the king in June of 1400, so he could not have been in prison for more than a month and a half at most, significantly less time than Isabelle was there. Jehanneau was clearly not patient enough to wait for his wife to come back and break him out of prison, too. Possibly a good call on his part. All the narratives that we have considered to this point have ultimately been narratives about taking advantage of an imprisonment that was not completely secure. From Jehanneau's escape through the moat while awaiting transportation to Bernay, to Henri de Sauché's chance to join an escape in progress, to Isabelle awaiting her husband's ladder, none of the imprisoned requesting remission seem to have put much effort or planning into their own release. The last two stories we are going to look at today, on the other hand, are definitely narratives about people who, as Joan of Arc would put it, helped themselves. The first story comes from 2 letters of remission, both composed in 1448. According to these letters, Jehan Bavatier was arrested in Valais in November of 1447, and placed in irons in a well-guarded room both day and night, until 8 days before Pentecost, when the king's commissionaire insisted on requisitioning that room for his own prisoner, forcing Pierre Parel, the jailer, to find another room for Jehan Bavatier. In the meantime, Bavatier had been busy getting to know Pierre's 12-year-old daughter, who was occasionally asked to guard him, along with her tutor, a clerk of about 16 or 17. Bavatier used his time well, persuading the jailer's daughter to run away with him, and promising her rings, jewels, and marriage. To her tutor, Bavatier promised benefices and other goods, and the two agreed to help him. First, they smuggled in some tools to help him break out of his chains, and then he pretended to be sick in order to establish a reason for special attention. The jailer called a doctor and a surgeon to visit him, and at the same time checked his irons, which were still secure. Very early the next morning, Bavatier began to bang on his door, demanding water, and saying that he would die of thirst. Pierre's daughter, who was already up, took the keys and went to his room, as if she were going to give him some water, but of course instead she broke him out of the prison, taking Pierre's cloak as a disguise, and immediately joining with a group of pilgrims who were coming to the city for Pentecost. The letter, composed on behalf of the jailer, mentions that his daughter and the clerk had already been arrested. Bavatier abandoned her soon after she fulfilled his purpose. The second story, from May 1424, is a more subtle narrative of the ingratiating prisoner. It was composed on behalf of Guillaume Astet, jailer of Gisors. He had in his charge a soldier named Colin Dupont, who had been part of the garrison at Ivry. The 2 other men, captured along with Dupont, were swiftly found guilty of war crimes against the English King of France and executed. But despite multiple interrogations under torture, Dupont would not confess to anything, and there was no other evidence that he was guilty of wrongdoing. The letter explains that Guillaume had kept the said Dupont very strictly for a long time, which is to say, almost the entirety of Lent. But as the imprisonment stretched on with no resolution, Guillaume allowed Dupont to move into his own room, though he kept his legs shackled. Dupont had gradually, over the course of a month and a half, won his way into the friendship of his jailer, who not only chose to ameliorate his treatment, but seems to have believed in his innocence. One day, when Guillaume went out of town briefly, leaving his wife in charge of the prison, Dupont took his chance to flee. Guillaume's wife was occupied with preparing food for the other prisoners when Dupont informed her that he really needed to go to the privy chamber. Since she was so occupied, she debonairly told him to go. It was not until after she had finished serving the other prisoners that she realized Dupont had been gone a long time, and she went to the privy chamber to discover that he had managed to steal a tool, break out of his chains, then escape through the hole in the privy, which led out into a garden near the city walls. Dupont was able to scale the walls and then drop down through a lucarne into the fosse and get away. This story is fascinating on so many levels, not least of which is what it tells us about privies in medieval prisons. As an aside, my interest in this story has been the bane of my husband's existence, since I now insist on looking for the privies at any medieval sites we visit to try to determine whether someone could really escape through them. The work of Martha Baylis has been instrumental in exploring the theme of the management of excrement in the Middle Ages. As she notes, many privies and latrines were built over running water, but others, like the one used by Dupont, emptied into cesspits. In castles, as well as private homes, they were usually constructed in the outside wall, which helped to keep the filth away from the main living areas, but also created a breach in the protective enclosure that could potentially be used both to get out and to get in, which would be a particularly significant problem during sieges. Some privies and castle walls in particular were built with a containing wall around them to prevent this. Unfortunately, the letter about Colin Dupont's escape does not provide us with further details about what the privy looked like. The letter does bring home the difficult position of the jailer, however. Guillaume Aste was faced with a prisoner who did not confess to any crime, and there were no accusations against him. In these circumstances, he relaxed his guard, allowing Colin Dupont to move out of the prison and into the jailer's own private quarters. Though Guillaume insisted that he kept Colin Dupont in fetters, the image that results is of a companionable relationship, one where it was natural for Guillaume's wife to debonairly tell Colin to go ahead and use the privy. Colin's escape reads like the action of a devious plotter able to smile at his jailer while planning to evade him. Whereas other prisoners escaped because of an opportune moment, Colin Dupont and Joan Bevatier craftily engineered their own. The final story combines both the literally miraculous opportunity with the hard work necessary to capitalize on an escape. In 1490, Pierre Tonec was imprisoned for attacking and attempting to rob a woman who was the lover of a priest. He happened to overhear the lieutenant saying that his case was going badly, and in desperation, he called on Notre-Dame-des-Plaines, requesting that she listen to his need. At that very moment, his chains broke. However, that miracle was not enough to allow him to escape from prison. Fortunately, a companion of his was also imprisoned, but not kept in irons, and he had stolen the keys of the prison while the jailer was away. Opening the door of the cell, he said to Pierre, "My friend, come out, because now is the time." Pierre not only took advantage of his moment, but also carefully timed his supplication to the king, waiting until the king was celebrating a royal entry in Vienne and turning himself into the prison there. Even with the assistance of a miracle, Pierre Tonec needed to help himself. These narratives about breaking out of prison highlight some of the inherent contradictions in medieval understandings of prison. Joan of Arc's belief that it is lawful for those imprisoned to try to escape was not shared by her captors. However, even the normative law codes of the late Middle Ages reflect some uncertainty about whether escape from prison is a crime in and of itself, or whether it simply confirms the individual's guilt. Philippe de Beaumanoir's explanation of prison for coercion acknowledges that there are legitimate and illegitimate forms of incarceration, But he also admits that royal prison officials could be open to bribery in exchange for release. As we saw in the letter written on behalf of Estienne Wingham, there certainly were such officials. Finally, these narratives provide some fascinating details about the difficulties of imprisonment in the late Middle Ages, from the perspective of both the imprisoned and their guards. They reveal the porosity of the prison through privies, moats, and windows, using ladders, ropes, and trestles. But they also reveal how difficult it was for guards like Guillaume Aste to walk the line between strict or even cruel disciplinarian and friendly caretaker. In several cases, the letters suggest that prisoners simply took advantage of moments of laxity on the part of their guards, viewing the opportunity to escape as a form of permission, much as Joan of Arc claimed that if her door were open and there were no guards on duty, she would assume that God was sending her a message that she should escape. While these more mundane prisoners might not have been expecting a miraculous sign from God, and indeed, even after Pierre Tonek received miraculous aid, he still had to work quite hard to help himself get away, it is clear that there was a general cultural expectation that prisoners would escape, if only they could. Thank you.